Hello, everyone. Welcome to our conference, The Female Artist as an Icon of National Modernization. My name is Olha Poliukhovych, and today I'm going to lead a book talk. We are going to discuss Jessica Zychowicz's book, Superfluous Women, Art, Feminism, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine. Before that, I would like to take a chance and thank to Ukrainian Fulbright Circle and Fulbright program in Ukraine for their support of this event. And now my pleasure to introduce our author, Jessica Zychowicz. Jessica Zychowicz is the director of the Fulbright program in Ukraine and head of the Kyiv office of the Institute of International Education. In 2017-2018, she was a US Fulbright scholar in area and gender studies to Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Dr. Zychowicz has held numerous research positions, including at the University of Toronto Monk School of Global Affairs, 2015-2016, at the University of Alberta, 2018-2021, and Uppsala University in Sweden, 2019. Dr. Zychowicz earned her doctorate at the University of Michigan in Slavic languages and literatures. She holds a BA from UC Berkeley. Over the past 3 years, Jessica has given over 35 talks and interviews in 10 countries, written over 15 articles, and published her monograph, Superfluous Women, Art, Feminism, and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine, University of Toronto Press, 2020. This book received the honorable mention for the Omelian Pritsak Prize, which is given by Harvard, for the best book in Ukrainian studies, published in 2018-2020. This book also received second place in the MLA Aldo Jean Salioni Prize for best book worldwide in Slavic languages and literature. The book will also be published in Ukrainian and at Kritika Press and in Polish at Museum Sztuki Nowoczesnej in 2022. Dr. Zychowicz is a member of several professional associations in global higher education, including an associate member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society of America and an advisory board member of HNet Ukraine and HNet Humanities and Social Sciences Online. Dr. Zychowicz has also worked in the US government at the Department of Homeland Security, QH, in Washington, D.C. as a training specialist for mid-career professionals in digital infrastructure, and also served a full term as a Peace Corps volunteer to Ukraine from 2005 to 2007. Okay, and I would like to quote Dr. Zychowicz. This is a quotation from her book, which is going to inspire our further discussion. I believe that what has kept a core cluster of writers, researchers, and visionaries of my generation intellectually bound, both across borders and to others who have walked these paths before us, is our shared commitment to human rights in the way in which we choose to live our lives, and in the conviction that a revolution is a front runner of better things to come. Okay, Jessica, my pleasure. So the floor is yours now, please.
Дуже дякую, Olha. And also I want to say thank you to my fellow Fulbrighters here, some of you who have planned this conference. This is such a special community, and I'm very honored to have the opportunity to share this book with you. The trajectory of writing this text was really a community effort, and I have to say that my colleagues at Kyiv-Mohyla were there with me from the beginning in 2009 when I started to write my dissertation. That took a long time and then became a book many postdocs later. Tamara Martsenyuk, Dr. Tamara Martsenyuk is one of these people, as is Anastasia Ryabchuk, Dr. Ryabchuk, and Dr. Kostyshenko, and Dr. Anna Kaluger. These women have done a lot for gender studies, not only at Kyiv-Mohyla, but I think in the wider scholarly community in Ukraine and also activist community. Something that this book taught me from the beginning was that Ukraine has a strong civil society. In 2008, before the Maidan Revolution of Dignity, which nobody could see coming at that time, there was much less attention, global attention to Ukraine. I had lived in Ukraine as a Peace Corps volunteer in Sambir in Lvivska Oblast, 2005 to 2007, just after the Orange Revolution. And I really learned from my students at that time how Ukraine has this special, very active volunteerism, this spirit of doing things in the community, to not wait for somebody else to do it for you, not depend on, distant government policy to correct the problems in one's life, but to act. That, I think, attitude or that vision that Ukraine has for itself continues. And I know now the world is paying attention. Much more often we see Ukraine in the media, in the US, and I think that is wonderful. One of the outcomes of the Revolution of Dignity that not necessarily was there in the years between the Orange Revolution and Revolution of Dignity. So these were the years that I was conducting research for this book, and these are the years that this book is about. It's about the decade between. It's not a lost decade, and just now more writers, more cultural historians are starting to look at that time period and see what was going on, rather than focus on the Revolution of Dignity as a spontaneous phenomenon or as a catalyst for some tabula rasa that came afterward. The work of activism is not easy work, and the interlocutors, the people who I interviewed about feminism starting in 2009 until 2016, when I finished the research part and really started writing this book, they trusted me as a researcher from the West with a lot of sensitive information and trusted me for many years. So I think the integrity of this book is very much about the people who shared with me the struggles that they were facing here, and some continue to face, and the achievements as well. Some of those figures, like Tamara Martsenyuk as a scholar, but also there's Olga Brukovecka, who is more of an activist and works in the cultural sphere. So the cultural sphere in this book is not running parallel to feminism or revolution. These three, I guess, key words in the title, art, feminism, and revolution, are really intertwined. And the biographies of the actors, as we say in historiography, the actors of this text, their biographies are, I guess they're still open books. So the challenge of writing a contemporary cultural history is that you as the researcher, and I know many of you here are still working on your projects as graduate students, maybe writing your dissertations. How to be objective is a challenge when you are also a woman, maybe from a different side of the ocean. But my approach is one that I very much appreciate. It's taken from anthropology. So I was working with these interviews and cultural texts as a literary scholar, but in conversation with sociologist Elena Gapova from Minsk originally, one of the founders of the Belarusian School of Gender Studies in the European Humanities University, but now is at Western Michigan University and was, on my dissertation committee in Michigan. I also worked with the anthropologist Sarah Phillips, who wrote a book about women's activism in Ukraine in the 1990s, because to understand the 21st century, we need to understand what came before. And digging deeper and deeper into the layers of the idea of, the woman question, or the ideology behind March 8th as a Soviet day being reclaimed by younger generations in Ukraine, was complicated to navigate objectively, because I share some of the same political values as my interlocutors. So I wrote this book in the first person in some places to make that clear, that I'm writing an ethnography in understanding these as living texts and relations between people. I'm not making sociological claims about feminism and power, but I do cite the works of sociologists who have done excellent work on Ukraine in those terms. And in that sense, my hope is for this book to engage future researchers and students to be able to extrapolate meaning out of some of that work in the cultural sphere, if that makes sense. But before I go further in summarizing the broad arc of this book, I want to share with you some of the images to draw you into the story a little bit. So I will share my screen. So the female artist as an icon of national modernization is our theme today. And Lesa Ukrainka in this book does appear as an icon for the feminist group that no longer exists, but for several years, from 2011 until 2015, were very active in Ukraine, and they were called Feministic Offensive. And their colors were, the purple symbol, the purple color symbol of feminism, and their icon was Lesa Ukrainka. And they, started the first women's marches here on March 8th and wrote a wonderful and interesting manifesto. They still also have a lot of their personal artifacts in their own archives, because they were, organizing cultural events, film festival. Zhinka Zakino Kamroyu was the first one that they organized, named after Dziga Vertov's famous film Cholovik Zakino Kamroyu. And they were also collecting and working with sociologists to analyze hiring and labor equality. Really focusing on workers' rights and trying to bring attention really to among students to debates in Ukraine around fair hiring and anti-discrimination laws. Some of the women in that group were Olha Plokhodnik and Maria Mayerchik. They, since I know, are in Canada, but they have still followed a lot of the similar pathways that other members have, which is to continue publishing papers about feminism and gender equality in Ukraine. Natalia Chermalov is another person who was in the group who I spent a lot of time engaging with, interacting. We even co-published some papers together about different views on the Occupy Wall Street movement, because that was happening in 2010, 2008, right around when I was researching her activism. So that was very interesting, working also in journals that are transatlantic, like Kritika, and Spilne, which is more local, gave us platforms that we could translate terms for women's activism, because we're from, the United States is not the same at all, and we have different vocabulary for women's rights, but there are also a lot of things that we shared. So that's the early days of how I started to work with this material. And here's the end point. I didn't really have an end point for this story until the Maidan Revolution of Dignity happened, and Feministic Offensive, which was very active intellectually and very interesting for me, they disbanded on the Maidan over disagreements about whether or not revolution should involve violence, or how to as feminists engage with some of the questions around weapons, and these are classical questions that also, I mean, classical in the sense of the question of power in the woman's body and its relationship to the state, being, since we're talking about nation and modernization, the idea of modernity really came about in the mid-20th century, a lot of it connected to the development of weaponry and war. And I'm thinking of theorist Cynthia Inlow's famous book, Bananas, Bombs, and Beaches, about the United States' role in the 20th century in exactly that kind of development, and her feminist approach to a kind of decolonial approach to womanhood in its relationship to national war machine in the United States. What does that have to do with Offensive? Well, Offensive was really supportive of the Maidan, and they, just like a lot of other women on the Maidan, which Tamara Martiniuk has written about, were supporting in ways that maybe were not as visible on the barricades with, weapons and fire, but in other support roles. This has its criticisms as well, as a kind of division, gender division that happened on the Maidan, and not everyone in the group could agree about it, so they split. But this book is not only about Offensive, it's also about different collectives of artists, independent collectives that now some of them are still, actively working, doing different exhibits and interventions, but most of them only in name, because they have since kind of had very successful solo careers in Europe. Now that they can travel to Europe very often on visa-free travel regimes, another outcome of the revolution, it's really changed the original cohesive kind of bonds that they had in their art groups. But this particular exhibit was not organized by an independent collective. This was some of the artifacts from Mezhehyria that were taken to the National Art Museum of Ukraine. And I was in Kyiv at this time, and in May, at the end of the Maidan, and I was observing everything that was going on around me and trying to document what I thought might be a kind of counter narrative to mass media images of the Maidan, and mass media images of also feminist activism in this period, because everybody in the United States knew the names Femin and Pussy Riot. And of course, I include them in my book and I write about them and I've interviewed them, but there's so much other activity that was going on that I am trying to document in this book. And you can see here a very moving image against propaganda on the Maidan. I think, Ukraine has been at the crossroads of really, powerful disinformation campaigns. Now, this is a global issue that every country faces, but at this time in 2015, it was so new. And I think these are some artifacts, some visual artifacts that I have from my own research archive that really show, now looking back, that the beginning of the 21st century has really been defined by struggles against disinformation and fights for democracy, which is the Maidan. And that is where my book ends. So in writing now and relating this story, I wrote it as it was happening, but now I see more in the story. And as I present it, I can really draw out what I think the essential elements are. And that is that the feminists in Ukraine, the gender equality activists, the artists, some of them not feminist, but really activating or trying to form solidarity or allies with feminists, as well as unions like Priamadia. All of these groups were very marginal and still are not representative of all of Ukrainian society. But by studying the margins, historians can learn a lot about the center, about what trends or what pressures exist in society, and studying them kind of on the margins, fighting for different rights and debating things like reproductive laws, abortion bills. It shows a continuity beginning right after the Orange Revolution and continues today, and had a kind of catalyst or explosion on the Maidan in 2015. And that continuity is really shaped by their generation, by people in their 30s now, at this time in their mid-20s, who did not remember the Soviet Union, were really formed by the Orange Revolution, and continue to really take a lot of their identity from this act of street protest that was not available to their parents' generation. That is why I chose to name this book Superfluous Women, because it's an ironic reference to concept in Slavic and more, I guess, canonical Russian literature, with the superfluous man being a character type that Ivan Turgenev developed and later was criticized by other writers, including Dostoevsky. But this character type represented a young man who was very privileged in the late 19th century in Russia and had lots of ideas, but couldn't really relate to society, didn't understand the debates of the mid-19th century around serfdom, and couldn't, relate to the revolutionaries of the 1908 and then 1917 revolutions. So the superfluous man was kind of a lost generation, and also a very bourgeois, privileged guy, like Prince, essentially, sitting, eating bonbons and not really thinking about reality around him. The reason I chose this title for my book is because Ukraine's feminist activists receive the same criticism, and they still do, that they are absolutely useless, don't connect to reality. Feminism is like a dead concept, but they're not. These are not superfluous women. And Femin became a poster child for feminism in Ukraine. Everybody in the US would ask me only about Femin when I tried to present this, work. And I do have a chapter about Femin and why it is interesting for media, and why media and Western audiences sees or are drawn to this pop icon of feminism, and why it was successful in terms only of populism, not successful in reaching to actual level of local debates in Ukraine and translating them for global audiences. I'm very critical of Femin also in the representation of race and ethnicity, especially Middle Eastern, references to Islam, and I even would say in some cases they are quite racist. I'm very critical of them. But I'm also aware that it's a production, and there are individuals that lived through their movement, and some of them, I spoke to some of their members who left the group and asked them why, and they've written about why, and I try to include those voices in my book, because I want, even in my criticism of them, I want especially English language readers to learn empathy, to learn not to hate these individuals so much, to understand their unique experiences, what led them to this group, not only what's wrong with the image in the media, but to go beyond the glam populism that everybody is already used to seeing, young nude women in, that I'm kind of forcing audiences to, in the Western context, in my chapter about Femin, I'm forcing them to examine their own stereotypes of what they expect to see from, feminists or from women from the Eastern part of Europe. I also talk about Orientalism and hegemony and discrimination, and it's a difficult pill to swallow for some who don't work with this kind of critical theory on a daily basis, or who would like to say it doesn't exist anymore, that we live in a world of utopia. But I do go deeper into the symbolic production of kind of femininity between East and West, and how more like the West kind of consumes different images from the East in the media, and also how East Europe, and also I would say Ukraine belongs in my book to Europe and to Eastern Europe, including Poland and Czech Republic, how certain symbols like the flower crown are reappropriated by younger women today, and also in the 19th century, as a kind of powerful weapon against Orientalization, that reclaiming some of these symbols is a way of reclaiming one's centrality to the nation, that is not just about an individual nation, but also about a region, that throughout all the different nations of Eastern Europe, this repetition of certain symbols among women is a point of building solidarity. And groups like Offensiva have done that a lot and very effectively especially between Poland and Ukraine. And that is one of, I think, the most exciting things for me in looking forward to the translation of my book in Polish and Ukrainian, to see that enact itself. These were just more of the images I worked with in my book, critiquing the world press photo competition, and again, the media's production of activism in a way that actually can do damage to activism on a local scale. So you have here the World Press photo of Femin in 2013, and in 2012 you also have sex worker. So Femin's big slogan was Ukraina ne bordello, Ukraine is not a brothel. I think it did a lot to get people kind of angry and get them talking about sex work in different countries and policies around it as a serious issue, though Femin did not go to the level of discussion that a university could offer anyone, even though individuals in Femin, some of them now are enrolled in universities and studying this. But here, this is an actual sex worker from Kyiv, and this photo was staged and taken by Viktor Penchuk's wife, who has a foundation dedicated to human trafficking and HIV/AIDS. I'm not advocating in any way for her or Penchuk. I'm just saying that's where this photo comes from. And it's interesting, it was also a World Press photo. And so was this photo of a mother caring for her son. And this, these three photos around this time were taken during a very oppressive regime in Yemen, and the protests there were then, picked up and taken into media in a mass context. But also this is interesting that Femin member Oksana Sashko made an icon using that same image. If you look closely, it's the exact same lines here. Like, she adapted it with a Baroque angel and a woman in a hijab, and this was the last icon she made before she committed suicide. She was one of the main founders of Femin's group, and after this suicide, they ended their group essentially. So the story is very dark, and in my work, I'm trying to really, again, talk about empathy and the individuals in this group, what they lived through, and try and see if there's anything that we can reclaim from that media phenomenon. And I don't talk as much about Pussy Riot in my book, but there are scholars of Pussy Riot, I think, who are performing the same gesture as I am in looking deeper at the roots of the type of activism that they are doing, which is media, essentially media activism, and where maybe some other groups have been more effective, certainly longer lasting and more inclusive in their work. And I'm thinking about Suzanne Lacey and Leslie Labovich from the 1970s. This was an anti-rape campaign that they staged in front of City Hall in Los Angeles. They are very active, socially engaged artists in the US, and they continue to do very big media art events to draw attention to inequality and violence against women. I will get into this piece. This was an image from Poland that was censored 1 year ago by the new director of one of the museums in Poland. And there were lots of protests, and it's since been put back into the museum. But this was an important, again, like point of solidarity between artists in different countries in Eastern Europe who would call themselves feminist artists, including Marina Abramovic and others. This was something that Femin had made before those protests in Poland. This is a Ukrainian artist, contemporary artist piece. This is another piece unrelated to Femin at all. This is by Oksana Brukovecka, who in fact wrote a great article for a Western audience called "Why I Am Not Femin, I Am a Ukrainian Feminist." And she made a poster campaign that she installed throughout Warsaw. She used the image of Lesa Ukrainka from the Hrivnia on the background, and in the foreground, she painted images of Ukrainian women, working women in not only professional roles like business leaders, etc., but also average everyday jobs like cashier or here a waitress or a nurse. And she received a very interesting response from audiences. Some Ukrainian diaspora members of the Ukrainian communities in Warsaw were not happy with her poster because they didn't really think that it presented Lesa Ukrainka to Polish audiences in the way that they would have wanted to present her, in a more heroic light, a more idealized way. And for me, and for us, we can also think about this together. What does it really mean to become an icon in this sense, to be canonized? Is it possible for Lesa Ukrainka to be democratized, I think, in the way that Oksana Brukovecka is doing here, so that women who don't have time to read, maybe who don't have a room of one's own, like Virginia Woolf wrote about, to write a book, how do they connect to a figure like Lesa Ukrainka? Can it go deeper than just a familiar face on a banknote? For a woman who's working as a waitress and maybe has 2 children at home, what does Lesa Ukrainka mean for her today? And what does she mean, I guess, in a larger sense, transatlantically? Because audiences in the US who think about Ukraine, I think, are just now learning about writers like Lesa Ukrainka. And I'm really also excited to know that Spain is actively taking part in this conversation too, because I think that as an icon of Ukraine already, there's a lot of potential here to maybe change that gap, that divide between classes as well. In this case, that is the commentary that Oksana Brukovecka is making. I don't know if I have a lot of time to go into depth about this chapter, but this is one of my favorite, probably my favorite chapter of my book, which I wrote about the works I wrote about the photographer Yevgenia Belarusets in Ukraine. And I guess I would consider her kind of a contemporary Lesa Ukrainka without giving her too much. I don't want to give her too much responsibility to stand up to that level, but she is somebody that I admire a lot. And she's the founder of Prostory, a literary journal here in Ukraine, and also a photographer. And her photography takes years to produce because she is working as a visual ethnographer. And when I was teaching during my Fulbright year at Kyiv-Mohyla in the sociology department, the course that I taught was visual sociology. And so I worked with the students on helping them to create their own projects. For me, Yevgenia, knowing her, being able to meet with her in Kyiv was really illuminating because she helped me to develop a kind of methodology for my students. And I also invited different guest speakers into the classroom, not only Yevgenia, but others who were able to volunteer their time. But visual sociology, or also visual ethnography, is a field of many names, but it's one where the writing about the images and the discussion with the people in them matters a lot. So here you can see the famous Rodchenko image next to another image of the outside of a building in Kyiv that is called 32 Gogol Street. I don't believe it's there anymore. If it is, it's empty. It used to be like an apartment building for lower income individuals, and many women were living there because during the transition, quote unquote, in the 90s from communism to capitalism, they didn't have jobs and they needed assistance from the state. And in my critique of these images, which I think are really beautiful, I look a lot at the writing that Yevgenia did about the people in them and her interviews with them in order to understand them and to help to translate their backgrounds, their material world, as well as the social world for Western audience in the US. And I rely on the theorist Svetlana Boym's work called The Future of Nostalgia. But one thing is that Svetlana Boym actually lived in the Soviet Union, and Yevgenia Belarusets never did. And I think what she is doing here, and I see now in other art in Ukraine, creative production, is a kind of nostalgia for another's nostalgia. It's not just wanting to go back to the Soviet Union or missing it or having some kind of relationship with it that is alive. It is a desire to understand lived experience by her grandmother's generation, and closing that gap between two very, very different lives that were shaped and still are shaped by different historical circumstances. However, there is something that is shared, that is continuous, and that's what is so powerful about, grandmother, mother, daughter relations and the transmission of knowledge between mothers and daughters, which is something that I see over and over in her work, and also now in the works of others in Ukraine, that this mother-daughter relation can be an antidote to a total break with the past and a way of remembering things that's valuable for the future. Here you can see aesthetically some of the parallels I found between her work and the editing or the composition of the famous Rodchenko and others after him. But unlike Rodchenko and unlike the Soviet school of photography, she shows decline and decay rather than the building of a bright future that never arrives. These photos, I think, are much more honest in the lived reality of everyday memory being in decline, that nobody can ever remember anything perfectly well. And she also did this series, which was curated by Offensiva, later put on display. This individual, Roman, started his own underground LGBT Orthodox priesthood, basically. And he was very religious, but in this time frame, I don't know what it is like now, but the church and LGBT culture were not compatible. And so he faced, after the display of this photograph in the CCA, was the George Soros funded gallery in Kyiv-Mohyla, which no longer exists. He had to leave and is now in Norway. He lives in Norway. So anyway, I will have to skip ahead so that we have a little bit of time for discussion, but I did want to show at least one or two of the paintings by Vladimirovka, because this is an artist who's very active right now in Ukraine, and maybe you will have an opportunity at some point to visit one of her exhibits. She drew many, many photos or many images, many drawings, over 1,000 during the Maidan, and she created them into a book called Kievsky Shodenik. And I know she has exhibited parts of this book at Kievsky Arsenal and in Lviv, probably also in Odessa. And since Maidan, she has also done a lot more in her work, not only drawing, but also painting. And what's interesting is she now has this kind of place where she goes to create her works, and she's regularly going to Kyiv, just outside Lviv, where Taras Shevchenko was born. And in Kyiv, she's spending her time making art, but also I think is reflecting on what it is to be an icon, a literary icon like Taras Shevchenko or Lesa Ukrainka. She includes Taras Shevchenko, some of his styles and drawings into her drawings. And I would really encourage, I don't have samples of all of those more recent productions, but I would encourage anyone interested to find or seek out an exhibit by her in Ukraine, Vladimirovka. She's very interesting. And here's her painting of the Lenin, a pedal in Bessarabka, which actually was the first Lenin monument to ever be constructed in Ukraine. It was in Bessarabka, and it was the first to fall during the Maidan Revolution. So since that time, artists have been converging on this site in interesting ways. Probably some of you have also seen installations there. And I think it's a really fascinating production of symbolic meaning to trace and to see how not only this Lenin plinth, but others throughout Ukraine now are evolving and developing in different ways, and also throughout Eastern Europe. Again, I think this is a place of symbolic unity, these kind of sites of emptiness of the former Lenin monuments that brings together an experience of change and democratization that is happening throughout Eastern Europe. And just like feminism can be a place for unity, for shared discussions, but also differences, trying to understand what is unique about Ukraine as opposed to Czechoslovakia in this sense. Here's another one. This was by, what is her name? Kibirova, Zhana Kibirova. And this is the one also near Bessarabsky. This installation was an invited artist's work from Mexico. And Izolatia, the cultural platform in Kyiv, held a competition. They received, I think, over 200 entries by artists around the world as to what to do with this space. And the entry they chose to move forward with was from Mexico City. So what is kind of unique, about this image too, is that in the media, like in the news articles that were written about it throughout different presses, not only in Ukrainian, but also Anglophone presses. A lot of the photographers showed people standing up here taking pictures with their iPhones and cameras and like making videos. So I think this is very much an installation for the age of social media. And again, it is a democratization of the site. At least that's my reading of it, because anyone can stand on the pedestal and look around. It's not a claimed space. It's using emptiness to make a statement that is, you know, taking the space of the power vacuum and putting that itself on display and opening it up for anybody to engage with. So it's a very interesting installation, this particular one. And I will just end on 2019 because this was the last time I was in Ukraine before I returned back to Kyiv. Now with Fulbright, again, directing Fulbright, an incredible opportunity, and one also that I owe to the directors that came before me who paved the way here for me. And this was from Kyiv Pride. It was a drone that was flown over the Opera House by Insight, I believe, the organizers of the Kyiv Pride March. And the next year, 2020, there was no march because of the pandemic, but they flew the drone over Rodinamat and received, I think, a design award for this as well, because it was a way of, again, taking the icon and modernizing it in a sense, because it's working to unite cultures and nations and peoples. And certainly there are many who study the far right and who would say that, I mean, there are real, you know, discourses that are anti-modern discourses that are couched in the language of, you know, anti-gender or anti-feminism, anti-LGBT, anti-Europe. And something that I always try to do is in my teaching and in my work is to show that LGBT and feminist discussion is not a leftist fight. It's also conservative. There are conservative gay people. There are conservative feminists. The, you know, mass media and different forces have created a situation where people are divided in ways that they don't need to be. That modernity is always, you know, not going to be a march forward in one direction to an end point, that we sometimes can circle around and go backwards in time and not really understand that modernity is, I think, now it's cyclical, and we are repeating some of the struggles of the 1920s, where people can be censored for, 1920s, I mean, in Ukraine in the late 20s, that the censorship, the level of division, and also in the United States, which the US has a lot to learn also from the 20s in Ukraine, late 20s, which is that dividing people by identities or attacking and making borders between different genders, let's say, as well as races or classes or political spectrum left and right is anti-modern. And that to be an icon of national modernization, especially for an artist to consider themselves at all involved in nation making or state building, can also be a kind of disingenuous relationship to modernity that I think for art and artists especially, and in my book also, there is a healthy skepticism of political divides and categories, and getting out of the categories is I think, good. It's healthy for us as a society generally, speaking very broadly, to talk to people we don't agree with. And my feminism, my approach to feminism is I think closer in this sense to what Jack Judith Halberstam writes about in Queer Time, which is one of, I think, the best books written in the 21st century, and is very relevant for our discussion and for this conference, because in terms of the idea of modernization, what Jack Judith Halberstam does and writes about is queer time, taking the idea of linear progress, a kind of masculine, military, modern approach to time, and updating it for the 21st century, making it queer, understanding cyclical time, understanding capitalist production, has a kind of pressure on the way time is experienced by some, and also, blinds others to their rights that they maybe could fight for or be in a position to fight for if they were able to have the time to do it. So that's all that I have to say for today. I know I've been talking a lot, and I would really like to hear any questions or ideas from the audience. I also wanted to mention one more thing. For anybody who would like to read this book, if you are not able to access it through your library for whatever reason, let me know and I will find a way to get it to you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for your wonderful presentation. And as our next session starts at 3:30, we still have some time for a Q&A session. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand and ask them, or alternatively, you can write your comments or questions to our chat here. Okay, I see some hands. Natalia, please go ahead.
So first of all, Jessica, thank you for your delivery and for participation. My answer is, well, you have stated that there are different vocabularies for women's rights in different cultures, in different countries, and why is it so from your standpoint? And also, could you please share your vision of Lesya Ukrainka's feminist vocabulary, or probably of some other female Slavic rights you have researched?
Sure. So feminism, just like any other ontology towards or orientation towards knowledge, involves committing to different schools of thought, or rejecting some versions or some feminisms. And to navigate all of these approaches is the challenge of scholarship. And I think in my approach, I am much more like Nancy Fraser and the Frankfurt post-Habermas school of critical writing, involving very close analysis of ideas of class and access to power, being one that begins with economic power and access to institutions and institution building. But there are other feminists like Julia Kristeva, who I do cite in my work, and she being a good example, I guess, of one of the big Slavic theorists of feminism, who are looking more at psychology and Freudian critiques of the self and awareness of the self and identity, and especially the link between sexuality and gender, which are different things, and our terminology for gender and sexuality, and also feminism being about power as it is applied or navigated through one's body, through one's identity, gender identity, and sexuality. Feminism is something that I think does have a universal vocabulary if you are an intellectual working with these concepts. if you are a Christavian or Freudian and you live in the United States, you probably have more in common with a Ukrainian Freudian than you will with a critical feminist like myself. And so these differences between nations or languages like English versus Ukrainian, they're not as important. So the concepts are what are more important. And the translation of those concepts is really difficult because of the different lived realities we have and different historical contexts we have between communities, between groups in society, and also, yeah, between nations. But there are some individuals and some groups in society that I feel, for example, much closer to as a feminist when I'm speaking to those who share my values in Ukraine than I would a fellow American who comes from a very different orientation intellectually or politically. So the nation binds us together in some ways, and for some feminists, it is a more primary lens by which they analyze their topics. For me, it's not the primary one. For me, the primary one is this idea of a public sphere, theories of democracy. I worked with Luke and Wei in University of Toronto, who wrote a great book about it's called Competitive Authoritarianism, about Ukraine and a few other countries looking at the idea of authoritarianism in the 90s and how it has disappeared. So I'm interested in the political science side of things, I guess. And in terms of Lesa Ukrainka, I see her writing, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is really ahead of its time, really critical of discourses that were building up and that didn't appear until the 1930s. And also Olha Kobylanska, who I think is even more maybe radical in making her statements that were also about education. And in Lviv, there's a wonderful archive I had the honor of going to when I was in graduate school to look at some of the materials there by Lesa Ukrainka and Olha Kobylanska writing to each other about organizing the hromadas and also organizing women from the countryside, really, who needed to go to school and didn't have the power to do that. And they wanted to, bring them to Lviv and form schools for them. So I was looking at what kinds, and Ivan Franko, was supporting her, both of them, in this activism. So for me, am really interested in Lesa Ukrainka, less as a literary writer only, but more as a very clever, scholar who could use her power to help other people, who could a social organizer, essentially, which was ahead of her time. Martha Bohachevsky-Homiak's book, Feminists Despite Themselves, and in Ukrainian it's Bile po bilому, is about this exactly, about women in community life organizing other women who couldn't organize themselves. And that's what Lesa Ukrainka was doing. She was using education as a social organizing tool. And for me, that's the kind of feminism I'm really interested in. I'm more interested in that than I am in psychosexual analysis, but I know that has its place too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have one more question from Roman Vretelnik, I believe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk, Jessica, for your research, for your book. It's all fascinating, and I also admire very much your passion for what you're doing. It's infectious. What I'd like to ask you about is something you touched upon in the latter part of your talk, and that's all the divides that exist in Ukraine and the different ideologies, et cetera, and how this concerns feminist groups. And my question is, something like the following. Do you believe that feminist groupings should remain sort of insular? By that I mean stick to the questions pertaining to what concerns them, or should they become involved in other issues? And here I'm thinking of, for instance, the language issue. Should feminist groupings, even if they're not Ukrainian speaking or regardless of ethnicity, should they be thinking of, at the very least, of having a very positive position as far as the attempts at Ukrainianization go, and or even getting involved? I know that some of them are very much involved. And the other question, I think, because when you talk about moving ahead, modernization, I believe, again, this is a very divisive issue. I know that, but decommunization. And my personal belief is that we cannot move ahead in Ukraine as a modern nation without addressing the past and without being very critical of the past, including then as part of the solution, decommunization. And what's happening in the States recently is remarkable. All the downing of the monuments to the Southern generals, etc. And as you were saying about ideological divides, it's strange that in Ukraine, it's the left that's against decommunization, and it's the other way around in the States. It's the right saying let's leave the monuments, and it's the left saying let's take them down. So thank you very much again for your talk.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you so much. Yes, so many questions to answer there. I wish I had really more answers, but I think with the language, I'll start with the language issue. You know, it's hard for me to prescribe at all what Ukraine should do about its own language policies, but from the US perspective, from my own context in the US, I think there needs to be, and I am already part of a very strong network of advocacy for more Ukraine-focused programs, to no longer be under the umbrella of Russia and under the umbrella of Russia studies. As a scholar, you know, this book I'm really proud of received an award from the Modern Language Association, which, you know, covers all university language and literature programs, German, Spanish, English even, and Slavic programs. And the Slavic Award, since it started from 1993, never, ever, ever had one book win anything on the topic of Ukraine. And almost all of the awards went to Russia-based studies. So that sends a strong message now that my book has won an award there to younger researchers and to others working in language-based professions, that you can build your future and dedicate your work to Ukraine. You don't have to be by default forced to become a Russia scholar because everything is dedicated to Russia. That Ukraine now is starting to carve its own space for study and reflection in the United States. So on a university and scholarly professional level, that's where I stand. And I belong to Shevchenko Society, I'm a member, and I think that more support for what is already there also needs to happen. So not only making headway into the dominance of Russia studies, but also supporting and strengthening Shevchenko Society and all of the organizations that we have. I also, on a political outside of, you know, the university, there are a lot of other places, obviously, where Ukrainian language and culture becomes, you know, marginalized by Russia in the United States. Maybe less so in Canada. I spent 4 years in Canada, and the Ukraine-Canadian Congress has, you know, huge following, and there are also really interesting and amazing Canadian Ukrainian authors who are not conservative, who are aligned more on the left, like Myrna Kostash, Marusha Bachurkiv, who's openly queer woman, wrote an amazing memoir, Food Was Her Country, Memoir of a Queer Daughter. This book was written in English, but should be translated into Ukrainian, because what it will do for the Ukrainian language is open it up more and more to, the wider global community and the diversity of cultures that exist in the diaspora. So I don't see Ukraine or Ukrainian language developing only in Ukraine. I see it in a global sense, and I see a responsibility on behalf of the United States and my own role. That's where I can do something. And decommunization is part of that too. My family history, my ancestry comes from Austro-Hungary, so it's pre-war, but both of my grandfathers were US soldiers, and one of them fought in Italy on the Italian front, and the other was in the Pacific. And that's a common story for families with Slavic heritage of all different ways. And the debates and what happens, I learned from my grandmother. Everything that happens in Poland or Ukraine will affect us in the US, and vice versa, that we think maybe we're in separate worlds always, but we can use that solidarity in our global ecology to put pressures on decommunization. In the US, the removal of Confederate statues is part of that ecology. I think the conversation and what the right is and what the left is, it looks backwards maybe in what they're supporting in the sense that the very conservative parts of American Southern society want to remove or want to keep those Confederate statues, whereas the leftists want to remove them. And then in Ukraine, you have a kind of, sometimes leftist impulse to overlook the totalitarian or the trauma and the violence of the Soviet past in order to salvage some of the good in the ideas of communism as being able to serve everyone equally. But I think in both societies, what we have in common is a fight about commemoration, because commemoration is not about the past, it's actually about the present, and it's about who gets what, and it's about censorship, which side censors the other. And this is a bad way to do politics. I think that what needs to happen is the left, the right, and the removal of the statue needs to be discussed in roundtables. People need to come together, names need to be named, lustration needs to happen, probably in Ukraine and in the US. Because without lustration, those are court trials, bringing tribunals forward for violence. There will be no mourning, there will be no trauma, there will be an absent statue, and it will have graffiti on it, and people will say what they think about it, but nothing will go forward without the process, the difficult process of going through, trauma. And I think that going through the discussion about trauma. I've done a lot of work in graduate school at the Center for Russian East European Studies with sociologist Genevieve Zhibzhitsky, who wrote an award-winning book about memorialization at Auschwitz. And she's from Quebec, so she's also written about Quebec ideas of national identity, which is really fascinating. But I think that, Germany is probably a really good model for a lot of these kinds of discussions that could happen in Ukraine. Poland made a lot of mistakes in the 90s around its memorialization projects, and some of those mistakes can also provide lessons. Others are totally irrelevant for the Ukrainian context, have nothing to do with Ukraine. So yeah, this is the good beginning. I think now that I have a lot of optimism, a lot of hope for the discussions that are happening in Ukraine. about, I know I won't even bring up Babayar because that is another conversation, but there is a conversation. So that's what I hope for. Not one more empty plinth, but a conversation, yeah.
Thank you so much. And finally, we have the last question from the chat. Halina Kogut, could you tell more about the Soviet legacy in art you wrote about?
So in my book, I begin in the introduction talking a little bit about the idea of an art collective in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian context, because English reading audiences really won't know a lot of the big names that Ukrainians will, like Dziga Vertov, or also, you know, even like the poetry schools that were writing. And then after, you know, explaining what these art collectives were, why they were working in collectives, what their, you know, ambitions were, but also their protections for one another within the bureaucracy in which they were being censored, I underlined throughout my book the repression by the regime that those artists had to deal with for making any kind of expression of Ukrainian national identity. For example, in the 1928, 29, you know, the generation that died under Stalin's gun, basically. And for Americans, this is something that doesn't really have an equivalent unless we're talking maybe about the death of, you know, Native Americans and the loss of their work, but the targeting of a nation and expressions of ethnic identity within art in a very fatal way that Ukrainian artists had to live through. This is totally unprecedented for American audiences and for British, for many Anglophone audiences that I'm writing for. I think I dedicated this book to women, especially artists who disappeared in their time. I'm going to read this dedication. This book is for my grandmothers who were barred from attending university, the women of my generation, and for authors and artists everywhere made invisible for seeking of voice, but especially those in Ukraine and Poland before our time who disappeared despite or because of their dedication to their talent, and for those who did not, whose words survive in our words so that we do not perish. So those who disappeared despite or because of their talent, and I would include Ukrainian artists like Olenka Pavlichko, who perished simply because of their talent and because of their identity, because they felt themselves to be Ukrainian. So for me, in terms of everything I'm talking about in this book with the Soviet past, that's what I'm talking about. That's where it begins, and hopefully not where our lived reality ends, because my grandmothers did not go to university, not because they were American, not because of their national identity, but because women were simply not admitted to universities until much later. And I don't want to ever have a future like that for my daughter. I think that having freedom of expression, whether you're expressing yourself as a woman, as a gay man or woman, or transgender, or Ukrainian artists like Olenka Pavlichko, Mikhailo Boychuk, you should not be attacked. You should not perish for that reason.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessica. This was extremely productive and insightful book talk, which I hope will encourage us to read more, to think more on the topics you reflect on. And thank you so much. Thank you, dear audience, too. And I invite you to our next session, which will be at 3:30. And thank you, Jessica, for mentioning Marta Bohachevska-Chomyak's book, Feminists Despite Themselves, because the next session, there will be a talk with Marta Bohachevska-Chomyak. Thank you once more.
Thank you, Olha. Thank you, everybody. I will see you in the next talk as an audience member. Have a great rest of the Friday as well, because the weather is beautiful. See you soon. Do побачення.
See you.